The wind cut over the northern plains with the same ragged edge it always carried at the end of summer, when heat gave way to the first warnings of winter. It rattled the loose boards that leaned against the side of the corral, whistled low through cracks in the barn wall, and pressed against the old shingles of a house that had held its ground longer than its owner sometimes thought it ought to. John Coulter, widower and rancher, rose from his bunk with the slow ache of a man who carried both years and memories on his back. His shoulders had been carved into a permanent hunch from fence work, his palms forever lined with scars. He never complained, never groaned, but his body reminded him each morning that life had given and taken in equal measure. He lit the stove with the ease of routine, dropped coarse grounds into boiling water, and stood at the window while steam fogged the chilled glass. Beyond the pane stretched the same expanse he saw every morning: pasture grass browning under thin light, a barn leaning apologetically, horses huddled near the fence waiting for feed, and behind the hill, just out of view, the quiet place where his wife rested. 10 years now, a decade of silence heavy enough to squeeze out every note of laughter that once lived in this house. John was 50, but the way solitude had weathered him, he looked older. His beard stayed rough even after trimming, because trimming was more of a habit than an act of vanity. His eyes remained steady, pale blue, with that distant fog you only saw in men who had buried what was dearest and chosen to live on. The town of Redstone lay 10 miles away. He rarely went. Store-bought goods came once in a season: salt, sugar, a coil of wire, lamp oil. The rest of his life was stitched together with his own 2 hands. Work kept him breathing. Work, and the act of eating while seated across from an empty chair. Every Sunday he climbed the hill alone, sat before the plain marker he had carved himself, weather-stained and etched with her name. He spoke as best he could, though speech grew harder each year. A man learned to keep words folded when there was no one to hear them. That morning, like every other, he fed the stock, mended a hinge, stacked feed. The silence pressed, but he had long stopped fighting it. Some men went mad alone. John didn't. He simply wore loneliness like an old coat he couldn't take off, yet there were whispers on the edges of the land, trails through the cottonwoods that weren't his, ashes of small fires along the ridge, long since cooled. He knew the Apache still roamed here, sometimes in peace, sometimes in anger. Most settlers feared them, some hated them, but John kept no opinion. He had learned over years of war and grief that men were men, tribes were tribes. If anger came, it came. If it passed him by, he took the gift quietly. This was his life, measured, stoic, unfinished. He never asked what lay ahead. He carried a single mission: to keep the ranch breathing another day. But missions have a way of twisting when strangers arrive at their edge. And the silence John wore like armor was about to be broken, not by speech, not by laughter, not even by love at first sight, but by 3 women who would walk out of the trees carrying history in their eyes and survival in their bones. Women who had lost as much as he had. Women who would change the way his cabin filled with light when dusk settled. For now, though, he did not know their names. He did not know their faces. He only knew the morning chores, the weight of solitude, and the stillness of a grave uphill. By evening, that would change. The day was long, hotter than the wind had promised at sunrise. John had taken the mule and wagon down the creek to haul fence posts. Their work was plain enough, but his joints fought him. He was careful usually, slow, deliberate, never risking more than his old bones could bear. But the earth beneath those hills sometimes played tricks, and a man distracted by thought could miss a warning stone underfoot. It happened as quick as stumbling breath. The mule shifted, the wagon tilted, and John's right boot landed on loose gravel. His ankle twisted hard, throwing him sideways, ribs against the wagon rail. A sharp crack followed, wood or bone he didn't know, and white pain spilled across his chest like fire catching dry grass. He gasped, tried to steady, but the world spun. He lay back against the ground, shallow dirt and sage smell in his nose, the sun beating down on his hat brim. The mule stamped nervously, the wagon creaked, and that was all. He drew breath in jagged hitches, one hand pressing at his ribs. Something broken, maybe more than one. In the old days, he might have cursed, even shouted for help. But there was no one to hear. Just the same land that had swallowed countless men before him, patient and merciless. He closed his eyes, wondering if perhaps his time had come to lie in the same quiet soil as his wife, without ceremony. But death did not arrive. Instead, the rustle of moccasins on dirt did. When John opened his eyes, he first saw shadows blotting against the evening sun, 3 figures, still but watchful, the outline of long hair, deerskin, and the unmistakable poise of Apache women. His hand, almost reflex, went to the useless revolver still holstered at his hip. But his fingers wouldn't close on it. The weight of pain kept him pinned, and the fog in his head whispered that drawing steel would be foolish anyway. They stood like sentries at first, 3 shapes against the falling light, silent and assessing. Then the tallest of them stepped nearer, her face revealed in profile. High cheekbones, heavy braids streaked by dust, eyes black as obsidian. She crouched, studying him the way one studies a fallen tree, deciding whether it still has life in it. Another, shorter, moved behind her. She carried a pouch at her side, and her hands were quick as birds, as though trained for healing. The third hung back farther, arms folded, face unreadable. Of all 3, she seemed the one who measured not his wounds, but his spirit. They exchanged words quietly among themselves. The sound was low and soft, nothing he could follow, but not hostile either. John, struggling for breath, managed to rasp, "Leave me be," but they didn't. Instead, the crouching woman reached and pressed 2 firm fingers along his bruised ribcage. He hissed at the pain, biting back a curse. She looked to the others and spoke one short phrase. The healer slid her pouch open, pulling herbs, strips of cloth, and a leather flask. John wanted to push them away. Pride swelled in his chest, the way stubbornness always did when weakness caught him. But then he saw the flicker in the healer's eye, a calm, practiced certainty. She had tended wounds before. She wasn't guessing. She knew. So he lay still, breaths ragged, and let them work. The tall woman steadied his shoulders, while the healer bound his ribs with deft strips of torn cloth. Cool paste smeared across his skin, sharp with the scent of sage and unfamiliar herbs. He flinched once or twice, but the hands never faltered. The third woman still watched, leaning against his wagon wheel, eyes sharp, almost challenging him to refuse their gift of survival. When the work was done, the healer poured water to his lips, just enough to clear his throat. He swallowed with effort. His gaze moved from one woman to the other, searching for pity or expectation. He found neither, only resilience, dignity. "You should have left me," he muttered grim. The tall woman's eyes met his, level as mountains. Her English was rough but steady. "We save." 2 words, nothing more. The others nodded slightly as if that explained it all. Twilight deepened around them, shadows stretching long. Coyotes barked from the ridge. John struggled to sit, failing with a groan. One of them slid an arm under his shoulder. She was lighter than she looked, yet strong. And with her help he managed to rise. It shamed him, yet humbled him too, this widowed cowboy. Saved not by men from town, not by fellow ranchers, but by 3 Apache women who did not owe him anything. He studied them again in the dim. They wore the marks of hardship, scarred forearms, calloused palms, dresses patched and frayed. Widows, perhaps. Survivors, certainly. They loaded him gently onto his wagon. The mule flicked its ears, ready for command. John clenched the reins with trembling fists, but the tall woman reached over quietly and steadied the leather for him. He didn't protest. As they set off, 3 walking beside, one hand steady on the wagon rail, the hollow silence in his life shifted, if only by a fraction. It was no longer absence that filled the night air, but presence. Uninvited, unexpected, yet undeniable. John Coulter, widowed rancher, had been saved. And though he couldn't guess where that act of mercy would lead, a seed had been planted. Come morning, his life would no longer belong only to grief and fences. By helping him, the 3 women had tethered a thread from his lonely house toward their own unspoken story, and that thread would not break easily. The wagon creaked homeward slow, each turn of the wheels stirring up clouds of dust in the twilight. John sat slumped against the worn wooden rail, ribs burning with each jolt of the road. Pain has its own way of humbling a man. Once years ago, he might have cursed the sky or tried to muscle his way through it. Tonight, weak and raw, he let the mule set the rhythm and let the women walk beside him in silence. The cabin came into view as dusk bled into evening. A tired structure of weathered pine, its roof slumping slightly, its chimney leaning like a weary soldier. John's chest tightened, less from injury, more from the thought of strangers crossing the threshold of a house that had known only his grief. His wife's ghost lingered in every grain of its walls. Yet here he was, half carried, half dragged by three women whose names he still did not know. When the mule stopped, the tallest woman reached up without pause, her grip firm on his forearm, as though she had done this countless times for others before him. He slid down cautiously. His boots dug deep into the dirt, and a groan threatened to slip past his clenched jaw. He allowed himself a second to steady, then limped toward the small porch that sagged after years without repair. Inside, lamplight painted the cramped single room. A rough bed pressed against the wall, a stove squatted at the center, and a shelf held the remnants of another life. A ring, a faded scarf, an old Bible whose spine barely held together. Normally, this place was heavy with sorrow. But now, as the three women entered behind him, it suddenly felt different, occupied, alive. The one who had worked his ribs earlier, the healer, glanced around quickly and moved toward the stove, crouching as if to judge its strength. She rattled the iron door, examined the ashtray, and gave the faintest nod. Without waiting for permission, she gathered kindling stacked by the wall, struck flint, and coaxed a small fire to life. Flames licked upward, chasing shadows. The tallest woman walked the perimeter slowly, eyes on the patched roof beams, as if taking measure of the structure. Her movements carried a sturdy confidence, the posture of someone used to leading where others hesitated. The quiet one remained closest to him, leaning against the table with folded arms, expression unreadable yet never hostile. John lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, a hand clutching his side. His breath threatened to stagger, but he reined it steady. He felt the weight of their eyes, not demanding, not pitying, simply present. He swallowed dryly. I don't know your names," he muttered, voice hoarse, the leader's dark eyes fixed on him. She touched her chest lightly. "Taya," then gestured toward the healer at the stove. "Suni," a small wave toward the quiet one by the table. "Naira," 3 syllables, 3 strangers, now tethered to him by accident and mercy. John nodded once. "John," he offered back. They didn't repeat it, but he caught the faintest flicker of memory passing through their gazes, as though they silently filed it away. That night stretched long. Suni pressed new poultice against his ribs, her hands steady, if not gentle. Taya fetched water from the well without announcement, setting it in a pail by the door. Naira said nothing, yet every so often her gaze found his, not searching, not accusing, but measuring. They made no claim to stay, yet they did not leave either. And John, fighting between pride and pain, couldn't exactly send them away. He laid back, eyes fixed on the roof beams he had counted so many nights before. Now, instead of silence, the room carried muted sounds, firewood popping. Soft Apache words passed between the women, the rhythm of shared presence. When he woke at dawn, the pattern of his house had shifted altogether. Taya was outside chopping wood, each swing marked by strength, the blade biting and splitting with crisp precision. John blinked through the cabin window, surprised at how methodical she was. The swing of an experienced laborer, not a woman playing at chores. Naira was squatting by the chicken coop, examining its bent hinge. John had cursed that hinge for months, but always put it off for later. She didn't seem the type to put anything off. And inside, Suni moved softly by the stove, boiling something that smelled sharply of herbs and bitter root. He tried to rise, instinctively wanting to reclaim his chores, his independence. But the lance of pain in his ribs dropped him back to the mattress. He cursed under his breath, only soft. Suni glanced over. "Stay," she said, her English broken but firm. "Heel." The edge in her voice left little room for protest. For the first time in many worn years, John realized he was not alone in his labor. The work that had chained him to long, bone-deep solitude was being taken up by hands not his own. He had no agreement with them, no bargain, and yet they moved into the rhythm of his ranch, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That day, the women carried wood, mended coop hinges with clever binding, and simmered stew over the stove. John, aching and restless, sat on the porch and watched. His instincts stiffened at first. Pride was quick to bristle when others did his chores. Yet the way they worked, with quiet competence, without a word of complaint or sign of hesitation, stripped his pride down to simple gratitude. At one point, Naira, silent as ever, brought a water dipper to him. He hesitated, her gaze stern and unsmiling. Then he drank, cool liquid sliding into heat-parched lungs. He gave the dipper back and expected she'd walk away. But she remained a moment longer, eyes catching his, then nodding once, as though she had made a judgment. She turned and left, and in that brief flicker John felt something unspoken. She had decided he was worth the trouble. That evening they ate together. He on one side of the table, Suni crouched by the fire with her bowl, Taya leaning against the doorframe, Naira perched silent near the shelf. It wasn't lively, wasn't warm, but it was not lonely either. For the first time in years, the house no longer echoed back his silence at him, and though his ribs screamed each movement, he carried a quieter realization beneath it. His home, once heavy with grief, now held voices, presence, and the faint thread of something yet unnamed. The days fell into a rhythm, neither expected. Morning light stirred over the hills, and instead of facing his ranch alone, John found the sound of Taya's axe splitting wood, the steady scrape of Naira mending, or the clink of Suni's pot, simmering herbs. John moved slow, every breath still jagged along his ribs, but his pride made him rise anyway. He had lived too many years without the strength of another hand to lean on. Habit made him try. Yet each time, one of the women would step in, not to take control, but to shoulder what must be carried. It was never done with pity. It was done with the unflinching steadiness of those who had buried husbands of their own, and still found the will to go on. On the third morning he tried to carry water from the well. His ankle faltered, ribs biting deep. The bucket slipped, spilling half across the dust. He cursed low, teeth bared. Before he could stoop, Naira had stepped forward. Wordless, she lifted the bucket with both hands, carried it easily, and set it down by the door. She did not smirk, did not lecture him. She simply met his eyes once, a look sharp as struck flint. Then she walked away. The lesson was clear: stop wasting pride where life required practical hands. That evening he lit a lantern, letting it spill warm glow across the table. The ring lay there again, a simple band of worn gold. He had kept it out of habit, not wear. When Taya's gaze found it, she tilted her head slightly, asking nothing aloud. John looked at the ring, then pocketed it again, quiet as always. Grief is not something explained. It is carried. She seemed to understand. Respect grew not in words but in space, the way he left them free within his home. He never ordered, never assumed. He offered a blanket, a seat, a tool, and left it for them to choose. They accepted work naturally. Taya with the heavy tasks, Naira with repairs, Suni with healing. Meals came with silence. Stew, cornbread, beans. And though silence had been John's enemy for a decade, now it carried weight instead of emptiness. Spoons stirred, fire popped, boots shuffled. He listened to their quiet presence, the way a starving man listens to rain against a roof. Yet trust is fragile. It must be proven in small ways. One cold morning, frost laced the grass, and the mule refused its harness, skittish for no reason at all. John went to settle it, his hand running the bridle. But the mule stamped, ears flicking back. His ribs screamed with each jolt of force he used. Before frustration could push him to foolishness, Taya stepped up, fingers brushing the rope. She exhaled low sounds, quiet, rhythmic, not words of command, but the old patience of someone trained to still wild things. Within moments, the mule lowered its head, calm as a sleeping dog. Taya offered the reins back. John met her eyes. "Seems you know beasts better than I do," he said. His tone held no jest, only respect. Her answer was nothing but a small nod. Over days, Suni's poultices stitched him back together better than years of whiskey ever had. She pressed herbs against bruised flesh, tied bandages cleanly, and once, when he tried to thank her, she shook her head. "No debt, life," she said, and Naira, silent sentinel, began to leave subtle marks of her presence, a hinge refitted tighter, a broken drawer fixed without being asked, snares set by the creek that brought rabbit for stew. John often discovered her work after the fact, and the only sign it was hers lay in her shadow at the edge of the firelight, eyes steady, saying nothing. Each woman carried scars, some shared in glimpses, a faded burn along Suni's forearm, the healed notch in Taya's lip, the wary stillness in Naira's posture when a door latched too hard. Widows, yes. Survivors hardened by the same cruelty that had carved over much of the land. But there was no weakness in them, no plea, and John began to understand something he hadn't in years. Solitude had kept him alive, but had left him hollow. Their presence, quiet and staunch, reminded him that survival meant more when carried together. One night, near the end of the first week, the fire crackled low while wind rattled the cabin. John sat cleaning an old bridle, his movements steady. Across from him, Naira sat cross-legged, sewing a tear into her sleeve with deft strokes. The stillness stretched until she broke it, the first English word he had heard from her. "Why?" John paused. "Why what?" Her dark eyes flicked toward him, then slowly, with measured words, "Why?" "Fight? You hurt." "Still work. You push when bone says no." For a moment John saw his wife again, her scolding smile, her warnings ignored. The ache tightened. "Because it's all I know," he answered eventually. Naira studied him, long and unreadable. Her needle paused, then continued through cloth. She said nothing more, but her silence carried a judgment he could feel. A challenge, learn better or break under it, and for the first time in years, John thought perhaps he could learn. The bond was not soft, not tender. It was forged like iron, hammered under survival, cooled in respect. They gave him no easy warmth, no indulgent comfort. They gave him presence, work, and dignity. And those things, far more than any whispered word of love, began carving away the stone of his solitude. By the end of that week, John stopped thinking of them as strangers. They were not guests either. Somehow, without anyone saying so, they had become something else entirely. A part of the cabin's air, a part of its rhythm, and though none spoke of future, the thought lingered. Alone was no longer the only path carved for him. It was inevitable that Redstone Crossing would notice. The town was small enough that whispers carried faster than dust in the wind. By the second week after John's injury, when he hitched the wagon and made the hard ride into town, he no longer arrived alone. Taya walked alongside, stride long and steady, always taking the side nearest danger. Suni sat on the wagon board beside John, her pouch of herbs slung at her hip. Nera followed behind at a distance, sharp eyes studying every horseman, every doorframe, every shift in shadow. The town's main street stiffened at their presence. Shop doors swung open, muttering sparked. Men leaned on porch rails, hands resting too casually on belt buckles. Women peered through windows as though scandal walked plain before them. John kept the mule's pace steady, jaw set. All he wanted was a coil of fence wire, nails, a sack of flour. But as soon as he tied off his mule in front of the store, a voice barked out, "Coulter!" It was Briggs, a ranch hand in town more often for drink than for cattle. His grin carried more poison than warmth. "Heard you took in strays. Thought you didn't like keeping dogs." The men around him laughed low, eyeing the women with the blunt hunger of wolves. Taya's posture shifted. Not fear, not even anger, simply readiness. Her gaze cut sharp as an arrow point. Naira had already placed herself half behind John, not hiding, but guarding his back in silence. Suni touched his arm lightly, almost a warning not to rise too quick. John felt the old itch of a fight crawl up from ribs still healing. But he forced his voice to stay even. "I came for nails and flour, Briggs." "Nothing more," Briggs spat. "Town, don't take kindly to Apache squatting in white men's homes. You should have left them where they belong." It was the same cruelty John had watched men lean into his whole life, that careless, empty brutality, disguised as laughter or law. Once maybe he'd have scowled and walked away, but now the women's lives hung on his answer. Slow, deliberate, John stepped down from the wagon. Pain flared along his chest, but he ignored it. His boots settled on the dirt. He met Briggs' sneer with quiet steel. "They saved me," John said. The words carried more weight than he expected. If saving a man's life don't buy respect around here anymore, then this town's lost more than it knows. The street hushed. Briggs's smile thinned. He wasn't used to being challenged without bluster or drawn guns, but with simple, unshaken truth. Behind him a few men muttered, looking away. Briggs shrugged, hollow. "Guess we'll see how long you last, Coulter. Ain't natural." He turned, spit again, and pushed through the saloon doors. John stood firm until the silence broke, then turned back to his wagon. His ribs screamed for the effort, but his pride was steady. When he climbed back onto the wagon bench, Suni's eyes held something almost unreadable. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Tyre gave a single nod. Naira, quiet as always, allowed the faintest flicker of a smile at the edge of her lips before it vanished, as if granting too much emotion might shatter the bond. The ride home was wordless, but it rang loud with meaning. Tension did not end in town. Days later, 3 riders came by the ranch fence, swaggering settlers who had heard the same rumors. They stopped near the gate, called rough words John didn't bother repeating. He went out anyway, hand on the rifle more for presence than for use. The riders pointed toward the cabin. Laughter followed, sharp as axes against bark. It curled through him like insult to wound, but before he could speak, Tyre emerged from the barn. She held her axe loosely, blade catching sun. Her face calm, fearless. Naira moved along the fence line, longbow in hand. She hadn't nocked an arrow, but her posture said she could within half a heartbeat. Suni remained by the cabin door, shoulders straight as though even words of contempt would not crack her. The riders shifted, uncertain under the weight of 3 gazes unbroken by fear. One muttered, "Not worth it," and a moment later dust rose from their retreat. John exhaled slow, the rifle heavy in his hands. He looked at the women, felt the strange truth of the land. They had not only saved his life once, they had defended it again. That night, no words needed saying. The 4 of them sat around the fire. He crafted cedar posts. Tyre sharpened her axe. Naira braided cord. Suni pressed new herbs against his ribs. It was not family, not yet, but it was something stronger than mere convenience. It was survival, chosen together and sealed against outsiders with a silent pact. A man like John had thought he would never stand beside another soul again without feeling the hollow ache of grief. But in that fire's glow, watching the shadows of 3 women dance across his cabin walls, he realized something had shifted deeper than bone. What had begun as rescue had now become alliance. Winter pressed down on the high plains sooner than most expected. Evenings grew sharp, breath whitening in the air, and the cabin walls absorbed the cold like old bones. John had built extra scaffolding into the barn, hauled wood higher against the back wall, chores born of habit, the ways of a man who had long prepared to face winters alone. But this season was no longer the same, because when night fell, there were now 4 shadows by the fire, not one. Inside, the house had changed in barely a month. The divider he had built long ago to give his sick wife privacy had been repaired and extended. Tyre and Suni shared one side at night, Naira often choosing the cot closest to the door, as if she trusted walls least of all. John took his old bed by the far wall, though silence had shifted between them. It was no longer silence of emptiness, but rest. One evening after supper, the 4 sat in their familiar places, John whittling a piece of cedar to mend a chair, Suni weaving small strands of dried grass into a pouch, Tyre sharpening her axe, Naira perched by the shuttered window, eyes on the shadows outside. It was Suni who broke quiet first, her English halting but sure. "You should eat more." "Heal faster," John smirked tiredly. "Woman, I eat near double what you serve already." She frowned playfully, shaking her head. "Double not enough. Bones old. Break easy." The faintest sound of laughter touched the back of her words. Taya raised her dark eyes from the axe blade. "He works too soon." Her tone brooked no weakness. It was the voice of a woman who had buried, endured, and demanded discipline from life. Naira finally turned from the window. "Still alive," she murmured, her voice quiet but undeniable. It was the first time she had spoken more than a few words in his presence. John set the cedar down, struck by the weight of it all. For years his nights carried only whispers to a grave. Now 3 voices, steady, distinct, steadfast, filled the cabin. They weren't chatter, weren't sweetness, but they were proof of breathing lives who had chosen to bind themselves to his. He cleared his throat, unused to saying what turned in him. "You had no cause to stay," he said finally, voice low. "Saved me, yes, but no reason to stay beyond that. Yet you did." Taya's gaze cut into him, searching as though she held back something just beneath the surface. "We stay," she said simply. "Not debt, choice." Naira's head tipped slightly, a faint nod, almost like judgment again, but this time it carried acceptance, not challenge. Soon he placed the woven pouch aside, long fingers folding steady. "We didn't lose much. Husbands, families." Her voice caught but did not break. "We know empty. Like you know, better to fight empty together." John felt his ribs ache, not from injury, but from the tightness in his chest. It was strange, unsettling, the way words from strangers could fill places he thought already sealed together. He had forgotten what the word felt like on the tongue. He nodded once, sharp, as a man would who had no greater tool for gratitude than agreement. Together, then, the days that followed wove tighter threads. With his ribs healing steadier each dawn, John took to the fence line again. This time, he didn't walk alone. Taya swung posts into place beside him, strong as any ranch hand. Suni followed with twine, fixing weaker joints with swift, practiced motions. Naira scouted ahead, noting breaks long before John's eyes would catch them. They worked as a rhythm, speech hardly needed. When he chopped wood, Suni stitched torn sleeves by the stump. When he hunted small game in the brittle frost, Naira waited, bow in hand, bringing home more than he alone could carry. And when 3 coyotes pressed too close one night, it was Taya's voice crying sharp across the yard that startled them back into the dark. Every gesture deepened the unspoken pact between them. They were not wives in the way town gossips might have assumed. They were not slaves, not servants. They were companions, women who had chosen not to leave, and a man who had chosen to accept. They filled the hollow spaces left behind. When John next climbed the hill to visit his wife's grave, he did so with careful steps, the pain still present but dulled. He stood in his old hat, snow brushing the brim. For years he had spoken to her of nothing but chores, fences, survival, empty reports to a stone. That day he finally said something different. "I'm not alone anymore." His voice broke, but he said it steady. "Didn't seek it, didn't expect it, but they're here. They saved me, and I reckon I'll keep saving them, same as long as my days hold breath. It don't undo you, don't replace you, but maybe it honors you that I can still open the door to another soul. Maybe 3, the wind cut across the ridge. He stayed until sunset, hat in his hands, grief and gratitude twisting inside him like strands of the same rope. When he returned down the hill, 3 figures stood near the cabin doorway, waiting. Taya, strong and fierce as a pillar, Suni, calm with her healing, Naira, watchful as shadow. They didn't wave, didn't smile, only stood as if they understood his walk was half a journey backward, half forward, and John Coulter, for the first time in endless winters, felt something warm kindle deeper than fire, not possession, not charity, companionship. Snow had settled deep over the valley by the time their lives found unshakable rhythm. Days shortened into pale sunlight slanting across frozen fields. Nights stretched long around the stove's glow. It was the kind of season that used to gnaw John down to thin marrow, his house echoing with silence so cruel it bordered on mockery. But that winter was different. The cabin walls breathed with movement. Boots by the door in more than one size, blankets layered with the careful work of other hands, voices spilling softly in the Apache tongue. Sometimes laughter, not loud, not constant, but the gentle crack of warmth against cold air. John felt the change like marrow-filling bones. Alone, he'd spent years mending boards, feeding animals, speaking only to a grave. With them, even routine chores carried new light. Fixing harness straps while hearing Suni hum over stew. Repairing a hen's coop hinge while Nera examined the fence line with hawk's eyes. Stacking split logs while Taya, always strongest, carried double the burden without complaint. The weight of survival was no longer his alone. It was shared, and it made him remember something almost forgotten, what it meant to belong, to be needed, not just for what work he could provide, but for the steady presence of a man determined not to abandon. One night, snow hammered the cabin until shutters rattled like drums. The four of them gathered close to the fire, wood piled high. Suni mended moccasins with neat stitches of sinew. Naira sharpened a small blade, eyes flicking to the shutter each time the wind howled. Taya sat cross-legged across from John, polishing her axe head methodically, steel gleaming orange in the firelight. Eventually, Taya set the weapon aside. She studied John long, her gaze steady. Then carefully, in English ironed flat but thick with weight, she said, "You are not alone, Coulter. We saved you, yes, but you save us too." Suni lifted her eyes from her moccasin thread. "Widows," she added softly. "Men gone. Homes burned. We three lost everything, but here again we live." Naira, quiet as always, placed her knife down and spoke the longest string of English John had ever heard from her lips. "We chose. Stay with you, work, eat, fight storms together. You are husband now, not by paper, not by force, by choice." John's breath caught. The word husband had long been shackled to memory, bound tight to the woman he had buried. To hear it again, from three voices, steady and sure, rattled him deeper than a bullet ever could. He stared into the fire, searching for words. Silence pressed around him, but it was not empty silence. It waited for his answer. Finally, he set his hands on his knees and looked at each of them in turn. Their faces were marked by loss, yes, but steadied by survival. They had saved him. They had defended his land. They had filled the hollow his grief had carved. And they offered no chains, no demands, only the truth of companionship freely chosen. "I buried my wife 10 years ago," he said slowly. "I thought my years of holding another were over. I thought I'd die alone, same as I lived. But you came. You stayed. You call me husband." His voice faltered, then grew steady again. "If husband means protector, worker, man who'll stand between you and what would harm you, then yes, that I'll be. For as many days as I've got left." Suni's lips curved, softness glinting against her stern eyes. Naira gave the barest nod, which for her carried the weight of a vow. And Taya, ever the strongest, laid a hand firm on his shoulder and said only, "Then we are four, one home, one fire." That night John lay in his bed and did not count the knots in the beams above. He listened instead to the soft breaths of 3 other lives in his cabin, to the fire licking the stove, to the storm raging outside. And for the first time in 10 years, the silence did not ache. It simply existed, shared, warm. Winter dragged long into spring, but the ranch stood taller than it had in years. Fences straight as arrows, barns repaired, fields tilled with willingness John hadn't felt since his youth. The mule grew stout with proper care, chickens fat from Naira's watch, herbs hung in neat rows above the stove where Suni tended her craft. Neighbors passed less often, wary of what they didn't understand. Let them. John no longer sought their approval. His home was whole by the only measure that mattered, the people who breathed inside its walls, the life that sparked again around its fire. When next he climbed the hill to the grave, he brought no excuses. He brought truth. Standing by the thin wood cross-weathered grey, he whispered into the wind, "They call me husband again. Not the same as before, different but real all the same." I thought loving again would betray you. I see now, it honors you. Because your death taught me how much a man can hold, and your memory teaches me not to waste what breath I've got left. I won't waste it, Sarah, I promise. The breeze swept soft down the ridge. John placed a hand against the wood and let his chest unclench. Below, on the edge of the pasture, 3 women waited, proud-scarred, unbroken. His companions, his wives in the only way the heart knew wives. His family. He descended the hill steady, the ache of grief still there but no longer steering his steps. At the bottom, Tyre took the lead rope of the mule. Soon he reached for the bundle of herbs in his hand. Nyera lifted the basket of tools he carried as if it were her own, and John Coulter, widowed no more, walked between them like a man finally reclaimed. Husband not by law, not by force, but beloved, chosen by 3 women and choosing them in return. The ranch breathed with 4 lives now, and against the endless expanse of plains, where loneliness could break even the strongest soul, that shared breath was strong enough to last.